History of Israel-Palestine in search of a common narrative. So the topics for this episode are the genetic roots of the Jewish and Palestinian people, looking for a common narrative that fits the data. As I mentioned, there has been over the last 20 years, starting with Ariel Oppenheim in Hadassah Medical School, doing research, originally the Y chromosomal paternal research, showing a relationship between Jews and Near East populations, including Palestinians. That sort of opened the door. And that was followed by sort of autosomal research studies where you look at the full genome of Jewish populations and Palestinian populations. And that also continued to show similar commonalities. And even more recently now, there are studies on looking at ancient DNA. That's where they dig up bones from the ground, and they did something like 70 samples from 70 skeletons found from about 3,000 years ago, showing that the majority of the ancestry of the modern Jewish people and the modern Palestinian people seems to match those bones they find in the ground in the region. And so that's been fascinating. And we, as people who've been involved in sort of peace activism, my co-hosts and I've long noticed, like, a lot of conversations when you start talking about Israel and Palestine, it starts to get into like who was here first, and starts to get into a discussion amongst novices often, but about genetics and about ancestry and about history. And then sometimes they'll start arguing, well, I was here first. And then I find that when you present them with this information, they're like, well, actually, you both seem to have been here first, and you seem to be related to each other. So now, take that information and figure out what that means to you and where you go forward. Also wanted to have a disclaimer, right? The Israel-Palestinian conflict is a very serious issue, and it requires an ethical political solution to resolve it. A common narrative is not a replacement for a political solution. However, believe that this discussion can help. Finding a common narrative helps create the mindset necessary for us to think together as what that solution might look like and how we might move forward. So that explained, I'm going to mention what I think are the three possible explanations that I use to think about this data. If Jews and Palestinians share some common ancestry, the first option is we're all the descendants of the Canaanites, like it was in the recent study where they looked at skeletons that they identify as Canaanites because they come from the Canaanite period, and that's sort of one narrative, that we're all the ancient Bronze Age Levantines, and there's some support for that. Then the next one is what Spee will bring up, is that we're all Hebrews or Israelites, Jews and Samaritans, and the surrounding Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, and all these people from the Bible that have a common Hebrew-speaking root in this land, and we are their descendants. And that's certainly, from the Jewish perspective, very heartwarming way to look at it, and that's very nice. And we'll discuss with our Palestinian co-hosts how they feel about that. And the other one that's often comes up is the Isaac and Ishmael story, the sort of the biblical story of these two brothers that were born in Hebron and went their separate ways, and their descendants formed what are now the Jewish people and the Arab people. And that narrative resonates a lot, and you hear that in the discussion of discourse. So I say let's unless my co-hosts have any comments, I say let's start with Carl and bring us up to speed on what is the latest, the state of the art for genetic research on Jewish and Palestinian ancestry. What do we know, and where is this information going?
Thank you, Rafi. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Zahir. Thank you for the invitation. And maybe I'll begin with a disclaimer myself. Okay. In other words, I think that I will, because I've been asked to, and out of politeness, try to say what I can about the specific question of genetic affinities and the use of genome sequencing as an adjunctive tool, along with narrative histories, archaeology, archival records, memory, and so forth, in trying to understand shared histories and ancestries. But I will say right up front that much of that is much, much less relevant to me personally than the single way overriding consideration that there are some 12 million plus people here now between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. And that's just living, breathing, men, women, and children. And to me, that eclipses everything else. In other words, I may or may not find an archaeological piece of evidence for this or that Solomonic temple or this or that prior population, non-Jewish, Jewish, Druze, Canaanite, others from 2,000 something years ago or 5,000 years ago. That is interesting. It may have, as you said, Rafi, impact on our current conceptions. It may shape the nature of nuanced discussions about grievances and injustices and events that occurred 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and 1,000 years ago. But overriding all of that is my view that we are human beings. That's our main shared ancestry, our main overwhelming, overriding, eclipses everything else by far, by orders of magnitude. And that's our shared ancestry. That's as clear as can be. And therefore, that is the main issue we need to contend with. Not saying to ignore what I'm about to try to explain very briefly, 20, 25 years of research, but it's to me more of an interest, a curiosity, but should, and as you pointed out correctly, Rafi, it can be helpful, but it cannot replace the active efforts that we should be making because we're living, breathing human beings and have need to respect that the fact that we're here. Some people may think that we should came here too late, too early, shouldn't be here, shouldn't come, whatever. But the fact is, we're here, and Palestinians are here. Israeli Arabs are here. Israeli Arabs who call themselves Palestinians. Jews, whatever Druze, people who are living here are here. And we are not going to be displacing each other. We're not going to be destroying each other. We are going to have to learn to live together. And if certain findings can help that along, make it more comfortable for this person or that person living here or there, then wonderful. I'm in favor of that. But it should not be the basis. And refuting a bit of common ancestry or a bit of evidence of this or that other should not be the undoing of what I view as the overriding reason for us to seek peace and be peace activists. That said, I will anyway, because you've asked, I'll try to very briefly review, because some of the listeners may or may not be familiar with population genetics. And just in a word, we know that of the 7+ billion people living on Earth, we each have 3 billion base pairs, and most of those base pairs are very similar to each other, remarkably similar to each other, so that all humans across the globe have shared recent ancestry. Actually, it's frighteningly recent, and it's a very small cohort of individuals we all come from. We've wandered, we've mated, we've moved, etc. And if we focus in, and that can be studied in many parts of the world, and we have the ability to, in contemporary living individuals, compare a small amount of variation among different populations and reconstruct through that variation patterns of migration, of admixture, of movement from geographic place A to geographic place B, introgression into another population, and so forth. And I won't go into all of that because there are many, many books and well-written and many videos and much, and I think many of the listeners probably are familiar with that. When we now focus in a little bit on the Palestinian people and Jewish people living in Israel and outside of Israel as well, and look at the variation, we can see areas of shared ancestry where there's variation that is closer among descendants of diaspora Jewish communities and contemporary Palestinians than with other populations, just in very general terms. It's not true for every single Jewish diaspora population who have recently being in the last 100 years, resettled or come to the current state of Israel, what was Palestine until the establishment of the state of Israel. Now, you referred, and I think it's extremely, probably the most enlightening bit of genetic work, is that which you referred to, the very recent study by Lily Agronet-Tamir, from Liran Carmel, David Reich, Israel Finkelstein. It's a very nice coming together of archaeology with genetics. That's why I like it so much, with history. And as you point out, it was actually 93 samples, DNA from 93 samples, 73 new and 20 pre-existing, which were analyzed and show what really we should have kind of, realized. Of course, we all realize it. There were people here long before there were Jews, there were Muslim Arabs, Christian Arabs, Druze, Bedouin. There were people here. There were people living here. These people, some, came from Northeast Africa, where all humanity originated and spread around the globe from. Some came back from the, let's say, Caucasus, or from the Zagros Mountains, through the Caucasus and various areas. They came here, and there were lots of people living in this part of the world. Somehow it was an attractive crossroads. Makes sense if you think about it, of geographic location, the Eastern Mediterranean coast. There were people here, and those people left descendants, and some of those descendants moved to various parts of the world, admixed, and have recently come back. That would be the Jewish establishment of Israel as a state for the Jews, with the establishment of the state of Israel. And there were other introgressions. There were introgressions or movements of Arab nation and Arabic-speaking people from the Arabian Peninsula into this area. There were indigenous, but when you look at the DNA, and this is very, very strong, I think, in this cell paper, that we can see a common shared set of variations which belong to, or which are carried by in a large proportion of the genomic sequence of contemporary Palestinians and Levantine Arab-speaking populations and Jews, even though they've admixed and brought with them from their various thousands of years of wandering through Europe and North Africa and further east in the Middle East, brought with them variation from those parts of the world, but also carry through those millennia bits of that original commonality. And that's what's really evident. And that is perhaps the most important part of the shared genetic narrative. And it's throughout the genome. You're right that the work started with paternal and maternal ancestries, that is the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, that was easiest to study in 1995, 96. But now the entire genome can be studied, and one can see these shared, so the Jewish people coming back have this tapestry with these shared threads, and these shared threads among them are also shared with Palestinians. That is kind of a bottom line message. Again, I go back and saying that's very heartwarming, it's nice, it's uplifting, it maybe makes this process of reconciliation easier for some people, but again, for me, the overriding ancestry is that we're all humans living here together. I'll stop there, and I'm willing to, obviously go deeper. I've given it a very, very superficial kind of sound bite approach.